Hello, friends. Here we are for another edition of our Period 5 lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the Union, um, some major changes happening, some problems and differences between the North and the South, and eventually, of course, leading up to the war. So right now we're going to focus on the Union in peril, looking at 1848 through 1861. And here's a little quote by Abraham Lincoln. The real issue in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as wrong, and of another class that does not look upon it as wrong. Abraham Lincoln, 1858. So between the years of 1848 and 1861, there's a major storm brewing, obviously, between the North and the South, which will eventually lead to the Civil War. These issues are brought about by a couple major things. Number one is slavery. It continues to be a growing moral issue in the North, and the South will continue to defend it. And as they continue to defend it, it will continue to expand in the South. We're going to see more slaves. We're going to see slavery continue moving outward, and the North is going to grow continually agitated by it. Number two, constitutional disputes over the nature of the federal union and states' rights. What are states allowed to do, and what powers do a strong centralized government have? Number three, economic differences between the industrializing North and the agricultural South, such issues, things like tariffs, banking, and internal improvements. And finally, political blunders and extremism on both sides is another major factor that is going to deepen the divide between the North and the South. So let's start talking about the status of territories. So the issue of slavery in the territories gained in the Mexican War because the focus of the section differences in the late 1840s. So there were essentially three conflicting positions on what should be what, right? So Wilmot-Proviso excluded slavery from the new territories, which would upset the Compromise of 1820. And of course, this was later defeated because they did not want to upset the balance of representation in the Congress. Then we have something called the Free Soil Movement. This was a group of people whose kind of mantra and bumper sticker was free soil, free labor, and free men. The Free Soil Movement was pretty monumental in preventing the extension of slavery, and they also advocated for free homesteads and internal improvement. So this would be something the centralized federal government would help them with, free homesteads and internal improvements. Of course, the Southerners, in their Southern position, most Southerners felt that any attempt to restrict the expansion of slavery as a violation of their constitutional rights to take and use their property as they wish. They believed also in something called popular sovereignty, which is going to be a major bumper sticker for this time period. Lewis Cass comes up with the concept of popular sovereignty, and essentially popular sovereignty means choosing what your state is going to do. The state will vote. Is the state going to be a free state, or is the state going to be a slave state? Popular sovereignty would make it so that instead of Congress determining whether a state would be a free state, the matter would be determined by a vote of the people who lived in that territory. So this is also a time period of many, many compromises, and we'll see Henry Clay save the day yet again in the Compromise of 1850. The territory in question is California. What is California going to become? Will it become a slave state, or will it become a free state? Henry Clay thinks that one, we should admit California into the Union as a free state. And then the compromise is that we would divide the remainder of the Mexican secession into two territories, which essentially become Utah and New Mexico. And then we would allow the settlers in Utah and New Mexico to decide through popular sovereignty if they wanted to be slave states or free states. The third objective of the compromise is to give the land in dispute between Texas and the New Mexican territory to the new territories in return for the federal government, assuming Texas's public debt of $10 million. Also, we would ban slavery trade in D.C., the slave trade in D.C., but permit white people to hold slaves as before. And finally, they would adopt the new fugitive slave law and enforce it rigorously. The fugitive slave law really kind of changes the game here. The fugitive slave law set high penalties for anyone who aided escaped slaves and compelled all law enforcement officers to participate in retrieving runaways. This particular law really makes abolitionists angry and upset because slaves were escaping to the north. Obviously, the Underground Railroad goes right up through to the north. And the abolitionists and other folks who were interested in helping the slaves were there to help. But now, if they were to get caught helping, they would be in really big trouble. They could go to jail. They could pay a lot of money in fines. And they were worried about this because they were, a major cog in the wheel of helping these runaway slaves. Underground Railroad. We'll talk more about the Underground Railroad. I have a documentary I'd like to share with you. But the Underground, I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of what the Underground Railroad is, or it was a system of conductors and stations that would help slaves escape from the South up through the North and eventually to Canada. Probably one of the most favorite and famous Underground Railroad conductors, if you will, was Harriet Tubman. She made 19 trips back and forth. She helped to free many slaves, including family members and close friends. Amazing story. We'll talk more about her specifically. Other issues with slavery, specifically in the North, or things that were happening kind of bubbling around slavery. Lots of pro and con literature about slavery that was being published during this time period. One of the major literary works at the time, was Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is pretty much viewed as one of the most influential books of its day. It moved a generation of Northerners to regard all slave owners as cruel and inhuman, which of course made the Southerners unhappy because they felt that not all slave owners were cruel and inhuman, and they just felt that they were doing what they needed to do in order to survive. Then there was another book, The Impending Crisis of the South, which attacked slavery by looking at how slavery actually weakened the South's economy. So the Southerners continually felt that the Northerners were just picking on them like a small dog that yips and barks and bites your ankles every time you're trying to go in and out of the house. And Southerners just felt like, why can't these people just let us live and let us do what we want to do? We let them do what they want to do. They ought to leave us alone. So that is another major contention between the North and the South. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about some other territories going through some struggles and strife here concerning slavery, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This all had to do with Stephen Douglas, who was the senator of Illinois at the time, and he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad essentially through There's my dog. Mags. Mags, say hi. Say hi. Good job. So obviously Northerners are not pumped about this, but and the bill gets passed. So the Northerners really at this time have a bone to pick with the Southerners as well. So as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise is pretty much repealed, and regional differences are exploding. We see something called Bleeding Kansas, which is something we'll talk more about the next time I see you. But basically, there's a lot of fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people in Kansas. It gets so bad that the pro-slavery people essentially end up creating their own pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, Kansas. The anti-slavery people refuse to recognize it, and they create their own legislature in Topeka, Kansas. So the federal government decides that they're not going to get involved with this, and they pretty much stay out of it. And of course, this pushes the divide between the North and the South even deeper. And I have a document that we'll read together about the Sumner Brooks incident, which is pretty interesting. Okay, another important, interesting thing that happens during this time period is the rise of new political parties. Increasing tensions, as a result of increasing tensions over slavery, which divide the North and the Southern Democrats, it's completely broken apart the Whig Party. So in the 1850s, we're going to see two new parties rising up during this time. One is the Know Nothing Party, otherwise known as the American Party. They drew support from Whigs. They acted on growing ethnic tensions in the North between native-born Protestant Americans and immigrant Germans and Irish Catholics. And then we'll also see the Republican Party, which was founded in Wisconsin in 1854 as a direct reaction to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was composed of those free soilers, so those folks that wanted to have some free homesteads, head out onto the frontier, do their own labor. They were anti-slavery. So the Republicans are free soilers, anti-slavery Whigs, and Democrats. Their purpose was to oppose the spread of slavery into the territories. Now, constitutional issues that arise during this time. First, we have the Lecompton Constitution. Under Buchanan, his first major challenge was to decide whether to accept or reject a pro-slavery state constitution for Kansas. He turns around and asks Congress to accept and admit Kansas as a slave state. Congress does not do so. Then we see the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court decision in 1857. Scott had been held in slavery in Missouri and then taken to a free territory of Wisconsin, where he lived for 2 years, and then he's returned to Missouri. He argues that because he lived on free soil, this makes him a free citizen. So he goes ahead and sues the state of Missouri in 1846. And in 1857, through a series of appeals and so on and so forth, the case is heard by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules against Scott for 3 major reasons.